stream, and then we shall get going. Excellent. Let's welcome Ellie again for the final talk. Staying awake in Gethsemane. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you. So for this third talk, I've got a shorter amount of telling you stuff to get through, so that we can have time at the end for some conversation, I hope. Right. This part is called Staying Awake in Gethsemane. Let me just read that really long quote again that was on your handout, because we're kind of coming back to that idea. And I can't see it coming up. I think we could do with a reminder of it. So, on that day in July 1944, when Bonhoeffer has just learned that the Stauffenberg plot has been unsuccessful, and he's reflecting on what that means for him and his co-conspirators and his family. And he says this: if one has completely renounced making something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner or a church leader, a so-called priestly figure, a just or an unjust person, a sick or a healthy person, then one throws oneself completely into the arms of God. And this is what I call this worldliness, living fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. Then one takes seriously no longer one's own sufferings, but rather the suffering of God in the world. Then one stays awake with Christ in Gethsemane. So as we've just seen, Bonhoeffer underlines the choice that God makes to suffer in the world. He also underlines God's powerlessness in the Passion narrative, particularly drawing our attention to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Gethsemane, Jesus is suffering. He tells his disciples that he is deeply grieved, even to death, and asks his disciples to stay awake with him. As we know, the disciples fall asleep while Jesus is off, apart from them, praying. And when he returns, he says to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour?" Bonhoeffer writes about this passage in relation to his poem, Christians and Heathens. He says the poem Christians and Heathens includes a thought that you will recognize. Christians stand by God in God's own pain. That distinguishes Christians from heathens. Could you not stay awake with me 1 hour, Jesus asks in Gethsemane. That is the opposite, says Bonhoeffer, of everything a religious person expects from God. The human being is called upon to share in God's suffering at the hands of a godless world. Bonhoeffer is clear that we are called to share in God's suffering in the world. We cannot evade this, pretending that we don't see the suffering of the world in which God is enmeshed. God suffers in the world because God loves the world. That love causes God to become incarnate, the God-man Jesus, in whom the world and God become united. You could say God's love for the world propels God into action in the world, into becoming a suffering presence in the world. For us, then, the question becomes, will this reality propel us also into loving action? Will the example of Christ as suffering lover of the world propel us into loving action in the world? Bonhoeffer exhorts his readers to share in God's suffering, to stay awake with Christ in Gethsemane. Now, I'm sure we all have very different answers to what staying awake with Christ in Gethsemane might mean in our contexts, in our communities, where we are in our lives. But I'm going to speak for myself here, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk about what things might have resonated with you in that sentence, staying awake with Christ in Gethsemane. So for me, to be invited to stay awake in Gethsemane comprises many things, such as being aware of and bearing witness to injustice and violence, and staying alongside people who are suffering, paying attention to their needs and desires. But there are two things that strike me most. That the initial call is simply to stay awake, and that the particular moment at which we're called to stay awake is one of uncertainty and incompleteness. In the Passion narratives, God prays to his Father, "Let this cup pass from me." In these texts, he doesn't seem to know, or at least it's not clear what he knows about what is going to happen next. This is not a moment in which great things are accomplished or wrongs set right, but rather a moment which could lead to anything, but in which nothing is decided. In addition to being called into a moment of uncertainty of open-endedness, it is a call to stay awake. This means being in a state in which we can respond to whatever Jesus might ask us to do. If we are asleep, we can do nothing. And if we already have a plan of our own about what needs to be done, we might not notice what Jesus is actually calling us to. No, we are simply called to stay awake, says Bonhoeffer, to be ready to respond to whatever might happen next. I find this call into uncertainty and unfinishedness helpful, because it goes against the grain of a lot of my own, and I suspect others' instincts. I find that often what holds me back from engaging more fully with the world and its pain is the knowledge that I won't be able to do that much. The struggle of being helpless in the face of the world's pain can rob us of our peace, and also of our impetus to action. What on earth can I do to alleviate the climate crisis? What can I do to stop the violence in the Middle East? What can my voice, my actions, my money, my vote really do to help? Surely there's no use in trying to do anything in the face of such insurmountable problems. Even on a much smaller scale, is there really anything I can do to resolve ongoing disputes in church life? How could I possibly make an impact on how my community is trying to combat social injustice? When there are no easy options for a quick solution, when we can see just how long drawn out a process might turn out to be, when we know it's quite possible that we'll put in a lot of effort and only to find that a project peters out, or is carried forward by others in ways we hadn't imagined, the temptation to retreat away from the world is strong. The temptation to do nothing, to cease being awake. By doing that, we might find a temporary peace, but it is only a thin, pretend peace, the peace of a person who buries their head in the sand. So the call to watch with Christ in Gethsemane, despite the obvious challenge, strangely reassures me. It's okay to not know the whole plan. It's okay to not be in control of where things will end up. Watching with Christ is simply to be aware of the pain and the needs of the world, and to be ready to respond in whatever way we can. Bonhoeffer's theology and the example of his life, also challenge my instinct to only get involved in the world if I can see a clear path through to a tangible result. That's what I like, because I like to be able to do something in order to get a tangible result. But his theology and his life shows me that there have to be other options to that. If we take his theology seriously, we cannot retreat from the world without retreating from God. And if we look to his life for inspiration, he did not shy away from the struggle of being involved in the resistance, for example, even when he could not foresee whether the resistance would be able to complete its plan to overthrow Hitler. In the event, he was left with the knowledge that the plot to assassinate Hitler in July 1944 had failed, and that an overthrow of the present government was unlikely except in the event of an Allied invasion. During his last few months in Tegel prison, he wrote some of his most moving poetry, including the poem The Death of Moses. In it, he retells the story of Moses' final moments at the top of Mount Nebo, where God shows him the land which the Israelites are to inherit, but in which Moses can never set foot. And there are some excerpts of this on your handout. So it starts. On the mountain peak where few have trod stands the prophet Moses, man of God. Steady as his gaze and tired his hand, he surveys the sacred promised land. Through this poetic narrative, Bonhoeffer tells his own story too. Someone who tried to help lead his people into a better world, and who has glimpsed this world, but will not live to enjoy its fruits. In the poem, Bonhoeffer seems to be at peace with all that he has had to leave unfinished. In the voice of Moses, he concludes, "Through death's veil you have let me see at least this my people go to highest feast. They stride into freedom, God I see, as I sink to your eternity. To punish sin, to forgive you are moved. O God, this people have I truly loved. That I bore its shame and sacrifices, and saw its salvation, that suffices. Hold me fast, for sinking is my stave. Faithful God, make ready now my grave." Of course, in contemplating his death through the lens of Moses' story, Bonhoeffer is providing us with an example of being at peace with the unfinished in extreme circumstances. More broadly, I think we can also get a sense from Bonhoeffer's life and theology of what it is like to be at peace with the unfinished in the form of fragmentation. In a letter to his parents written in February 44, Bonhoeffer presents fragmentation and unfinishedness as an identifying characteristic of his generation. He says, "Moreover, our generation may no longer expect a life that unfolds fully, both professionally and personally, so that it becomes a balanced and fulfilled whole, as was still possible for your generation. That is probably the greatest renunciation, with the example of your lives still before us, that has been imposed on us younger folk and is required of us. Probably that is why we feel especially strongly how unfinished and fragmentary our lives are. But precisely that which is fragmentary may point to a higher fulfillment, which can no longer be achieved by human effort." I think this quote speaks to a lot of people today who know that their lives will not follow the same path as their parents and grandparents. That climate change will radically disrupt what we can expect from our future. There is a sense of enforced renunciation of predictability and enforced renunciation of security. Living in this time of global uncertainty can make it difficult to read Bonhoeffer and accept his sometimes harsh calls to action. If you've been thinking today that Bonhoeffer is a rather unrelenting kind of theologian who puts the weight of responsibility firmly onto anyone who will listen to him, then you'd be right. But this last sentence from this quote points to part of Bonhoeffer's theology which, while not releasing us from responsibility in the here and now, reminds us that God is the ultimate reality into whom the world is reconciled in Christ. That last sentence is, "But precisely that which is fragmentary may point to a higher fulfillment, which is no longer to be achieved by human effort." Yes, if we want to follow Bonhoeffer's example, we must live in this worldliness, in our everyday tasks, and we must stay awake in Gethsemane, prepared to share in God's suffering, to respond as we can to the world's need. Yes, we must do all these things, but always aware that the foundational reality of our life in this world is God's revealed word in Jesus Christ. God is the ultimate reality, and nothing can be beyond God's reality. According to Bonhoeffer, this is a reality that we cannot test, show, or prove, but is a matter of faith. He's quite clear about that. He's not interested in any kind of apologetics that would somehow show that this is how the world is, or show that this is how God is. It's a matter of faith. Bonhoeffer provides many definitions and comments on faith in his writing, and one of my favourites occurs in the Ethics. He provides this explanation of what faith is almost as an aside, and yet I think it contains a lot of what we've been thinking about today, shifting our focus away from ourselves and towards God, and seeing God's revealed word as the foundation on which life is based. He says, faith means to find, hold to, and cast my anchor on this foundation, and so to be held by it. Faith means to base life on a foundation outside myself, on an eternal and holy foundation on Christ. Faith means to be captivated by the gaze of Jesus Christ. One sees nothing but him. If this is our faith, then we are wholly reliant on this foundation outside of ourselves. We do not need to rely on our own strength, but look constantly to Jesus Christ, the source of all life. When reading Bonhoeffer, yes, we're exhorted to stay awake with Christ in Gethsemane, but always given the strength to do so by the God who watches, loves, and suffers in the world. So I hope we're going to have some conversation now. We can talk about all sorts of things, and maybe for now or maybe for later when you go away and you're reflecting on today, I invite you to think about how Bonhoeffer's definition of faith might nourish you or help you think of the relationship between God and the world in new ways, and how it might equip you to stay awake with Christ in Gethsemane. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ellie, and thank you to all those joining us online. We're going to say goodbye to you now as we enter into the discussion bit. Any questions, comments, theories over here?
Picking up on in the Garden of Gethsemane, where you say Jesus is uncertain as to what the future will be. How does that equate with him weeping over Jerusalem?